All right, class. So welcome to today's class. I'm just pulling up the most recent announcement that should be on your screen that I posted. Let me go ahead and mute everyone real quick. You can unmute yourself. So in this recent announcement, I just wanted to remind you that this week is the lab kit pickup week. You can send someone in your place. You just have to let me know who that will be. This is our schedule for the next couple of weeks. The next 2 weeks are going to be pretty simple, not a lot of tests. So just we'll be getting through chapters and lab activities. And then if you go down to the bottom of the announcement, I have the lab kit pickup instructions. So you can pick it up on Monday, Tuesday, or Friday, and you're only picking up the lab 11 kit. And that's because the next lab pickup kit that you need, it needs to be refrigerated. So that's why you have to go back in November to pick up the next lab kit. But this week, try to get to campus at some point to pick these up. I can't send any out anymore because it's too late at this point. But please pick that up. And if you do have someone who needs to pick it up in your place, just let me know and I can say that name. And I think it copied twice here. Sorry about that. And I think that's it. You can stay in your car, just keep your mask on. And it should be a pretty simple process. You just drive to campus in parking lot G during that scheduled time. And then Rose, our lab tech, is really great. She'll be really nice. She'll probably talk to you and want to know all about you. But she's just really nice and it'll be a pretty smooth pickup for that. All right, so with that, we're going to jump into our next chapter. And this next chapter is on the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is one of my favorite systems because it's kind of a teeny tiny system in the body that's made up of lots of different glands that secrete hormones that you can't see, but that travel through your blood and do a variety of functions in your body. They keep kind of everything functioning normally, all of these hormones. So these are the glands in the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is located kind of in the center of the brain that will secrete a bunch of hormones. The pineal gland is located kind of in the center posterior part of the brain, and that helps to regulate your sleep-wake cycles. You have your thyroid gland located around your larynx in the neck, which helps to control your metabolism, nervous system, reproductive systems. And the parathyroid hormones are little tiny kind of pea-shaped structures that lie on top of the thyroid gland. And your parathyroid hormones help to control calcium levels in the body. Then you have the adrenal glands, which lie on top of your kidneys. The pancreas has an endocrine function in that it secretes insulin, which helps to control your blood sugar levels. And then ovaries and testes also secrete hormones, estrogen and progesterone and testosterone to help everything function normal in the body as well. So that's your endocrine system glands. There's different types of secretions that we can get from these glands. We can have cells that secrete their substances by autocrine. And autocrine just means that whatever is being secreted is released by cells and has a local effect on the same cell type. So that's an autocrine secretion. And that kind of makes sense because the word auto means self. So this would be a secretion by a cell that has an effect on the same cell. And an example of that type of secretion is an eicosanoid. A paracrine secretion is released by a cell that has an effect on other cells in close proximity. And an example of this is somatostatin, which helps to decrease your calcium levels. Then we have neurotransmitter and neuromodulators that are secreted by nerve cells that have to do with nervous system function. And then hormones and neurohormones are secreted into the blood and then travel to their receptor site where they will bind. And an example of hormones or a neurohormone is epinephrine and insulin. So here are the functions of the endocrine system. And again, I've always liked this system, or I've appreciated in the body because it's just very diverse and a lot happens in your endocrine system. So it helps to function or regulate your metabolism. And that's how quickly you turn your food or glucose into energy. It helps to control food intake and digestion. So the idea of feeling hungry and then digesting the food. Tissue development, ion regulation. Ion regulation is the big one with your adrenal glands on top of your kidneys, and also water balance. So different hormones will regulate how much of your kidneys will create urine that's very diluted with lots of water and urine that's very concentrated. So that's all regulated via hormones as well. It helps to regulate your heart rate and blood pressure, control of blood glucose, that's insulin and other nutrients, control of your reproductive functions, those hormones that are coming out of the sex glands, the testes, the ovaries that are producing testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Those all regulate secondary sex characteristics and other reproductive functions. Uterine contraction and milk release. So the idea of a woman going into labor and contracting, that is caused by a hormone that's released from her pituitary gland, as well as the release of milk. If any of you have ever breastfed your babies, you know what that feels like. And that's all hormone related as well as immune system regulation. So lots of functions in the endocrine system. So your endocrine system is composed of endocrine glands that I showed you where a couple of those were, and specialized endocrine cells located throughout the body. Your endocrine glands and cells secrete little tiny minute amounts of chemical messengers that we call hormones, and hormones travel through the bloodstream rather than into a duct. So your sweat, some of the oily kind of sebaceous gland secretions will all travel through ducts, but hormones always travel through the bloodstream. And hormones will travel through the general blood circulation to wherever their target tissue or effector might be. The target tissue will have a specific receptor for that hormone. So the hormone will produce a particular response in the target tissue when it binds to it. We can have water-soluble hormones that dissolve in water, or lipid-soluble hormones that will not dissolve in water because they're made of lipid. And water-soluble hormones are proteins, peptides, amino acids. These are the most common. So examples of a water-soluble hormone will be growth hormone, which is released during puberty to help you grow and increase in size. You can have too much growth hormone, or you can have too little. Antidiuretic hormone is an antidiuretic, so it keeps you from urinating frequently. And then prolactin is the hormone that helps you lactate or produce milk in the breast, usually after childbirth. Lipid-soluble hormones include steroids, eicosanoids. We have luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and androgens. And a lot of those will act on the reproductive glands of the body. So the control of hormone release, these blood-borne chemicals can directly stimulate the release of some hormones. So what this means is you have other chemicals that will directly stimulate the release of hormones. We kind of have a layer of control of these hormones being released. And these chemicals are referred to as humoral stimuli because they circulate in the blood. Humoral refers to body fluids. And all hormone release is under neural control. So ultimately, the brain controls how and when and what hormones get secreted. And that occurs when we follow an action potential. Neurons will release a neurotransmitter into a synapse with a particular cell that will then produce the hormone. So hormone release can also be controlled by other hormones. So hormones themselves can control the release of other hormones. It occurs when a hormone is secreted that in turn stimulates the secretion of other hormones. And the same three types of stimuli, humoral, neural, and hormonal, can always stimulate or inhibit humoral release. So for example, humoral regulation means that if there's low blood calcium levels in the blood, the endocrine cell will pick that up when blood calcium levels are too low. And the endocrine cell will then cause parathyroid hormone to be released. And what parathyroid hormone does is it acts, or it activates osteoclasts. And if you remember, osteoclasts are the bone cell that kill bone. So what osteoclasts will do is they'll kind of break apart bone, which will be breaking up the calcium in the bone. And that calcium will then be put into the bloodstream to try to increase calcium levels. If we have high blood calcium levels, an endocrine cell will detect that when blood calcium levels are too high, so it won't secrete any parathyroid hormone secretion. So that will not activate your osteoclasts to kind of break up the bone to increase calcium. So that'll actually decrease blood calcium levels. So this is humoral regulation, the regulation of hormones based on their levels of ions in the blood. Neural regulation has to do with neurons, where an action potential will travel down a neuron, and that will release some sort of neurotransmitter to travel across a synaptic cleft to attach to an endocrine cell. The endocrine cell will then secrete its hormone into the blood where it'll travel to its target. So that's neural regulation by a neuron. And then hormonal regulation just means that a hormone controls the releasing of another hormone. And this happens, the hypothalamus will release hormones. Specifically, they're called releasing hormones because they're coming from the hypothalamus and they control the release of other hormones. And we often abbreviate these releasing hormones RH at the end. So if you see kind of an acronym with a letter and then an RH, that is usually a hormone, that's a releasing hormone that's coming from the hypothalamus. So that releasing hormone acts on only the anterior pituitary because the posterior pituitary is controlled by neural regulation. And then the anterior pituitary actually secretes the hormone that we want to go on to the target cell or the target endocrine cell that will release the hormone that will go on to its target. And this idea that hormonal regulation, in this idea of a releasing hormone coming from a hypothalamus, acting on a pituitary gland to release another hormone is very common. And it's a common way we kind of control the release of hormones in the body. So we'll come back kind of to this sequence of hormonal regulation in a little bit too. Okay, so inhibition of hormone release. So we normally want to stimulate the release of hormones, but sometimes we want to inhibit the release. So humoral inhibition of the hormone release generally involves the actions of a companion hormone. And usually each of the companion hormones will perform an opposite function. So for example, if we want to raise blood pressure, the adrenal cortex, which is the layer on the adrenal gland, will secrete aldosterone in response to low blood pressure. But to lower it, the heart atria will secrete atria natriuretic peptides. So we kind of have atrial natriuretic peptide and aldosterone. These two hormones have opposite effects on each other. And then together, they'll work to maintain homeostasis of a particular function. Neurons can also inhibit targets just as often as they stimulate targets. So if the neurotransmitter is inhibitory, the target endocrine gland will not secrete its hormones. So sometimes neurons can inhibit their targets, and in control of the hormone release by other hormones. Some of the hormones are inhibitory hormones that will reduce the release of the hormone being controlled. And a good example of this is when thyroid hormones can control their own blood levels by inhibiting their anterior pituitary tropic hormone. And we'll talk about that kind of negative feedback control. Regulation of blood hormone levels. This is when we'll get into negative and positive feedback mechanisms. And these are the two main mechanisms that maintain hormone levels in the blood within a homeostatic range. Most hormones are regulated by negative feedback, whereby the hormone secretion will be inhibited by the hormone itself once blood levels have reached a certain point. And what this means is if you have enough insulin in your blood so that the blood sugar levels are back to normal, that level of insulin will then in turn say, all right, we don't need any more insulin in the body. The same thing with your thyroid hormones. The level of the thyroid hormone itself, once it reaches a particular level, the body can sense that, so then it won't secrete any more thyroid hormones. So that's negative feedback. Some hormones are controlled by positive feedback, and that just means it's exemplified. So the hormones, the level of the hormone will continue to encourage more hormones to be released. So here's an example of negative and positive feedback. So an example in negative feedback, we have the target endocrine cell releasing our hormones, and the level of these hormones, the orange triangles, once they reach a particular level, they will cause the anterior pituitary gland to kind of stop activity, as well as they will go up to the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus don't secrete any more of your releasing hormones. So that's negative feedback, where the level of the hormone, once it reaches this particular level, it tells the brain, all right, no more. Positive feedback is the opposite, where when the target endocrine cell secretes its hormones, that is picked up by the brain and it says, all right, we just got to secrete more and more and more. And I'm not sure, a good example of the positive feedback is oxytocin, which is the hormone that stimulates uterine contractions. And levels of oxytocin will continue to rise and rise and rise until the baby's born. So there's nothing that can turn off the oxytocin levels. So that's a positive feedback mechanism of oxytocin, and it continues to rise until the baby's born, until your body doesn't need that hormone anymore. So a hormone can stimulate only the cells that have the receptor for that hormone. And the portion of each receptor molecule where a hormone binds is called the receptor site. And the receptor site has specificity. And that just means that it only allows one hormone to bind to it. Some hormones like epinephrine can bind to a family of receptors because epinephrine is structurally similar to other hormones. And this specificity is due to the molecular shape and the chemical characteristics. Lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones bind to their own classes of receptors. Lipid-soluble hormones will bind to nuclear receptors because they're lipid-soluble, they can pass through the membrane. Because the membrane is made of phospholipids. So a lipid-soluble hormone can actually enter the cell and it will bind to receptors on the nucleus. But if we have a water-soluble hormone, remember that water-soluble hormones cannot pass through the cell membrane, so they will bind to a receptor on the membrane of the cell itself. So lipid-soluble hormones can get through the membrane, so they'll bind to a receptor on the nucleus. They can easily pass through the cell membrane as well as the nuclear membrane. Nuclear receptors can also be located in the cytoplasm, but then will move to the nucleus when activated. And when hormones bind to nuclear receptors, the hormone receptor complex usually interacts with nuclear DNA to regulate a specific gene transcription event, or to kind of activate your nucleus to create more proteins. Water-soluble proteins like protein and peptide types, again, they can't pass through the cell membrane, so they will just have interactions with receptors on the membrane itself that are proteins that extend across the cell membrane. When a water-soluble receptor binds to a receptor on the membrane, it turns on kind of an intracellular enzyme cascade that will ultimately cause the response dictated by the hormone receptor interaction. We're going through a lot of detail here that you probably don't need to know all about, but you should know that lipid-soluble proteins can get into the cell and bind to the nucleus, where water-soluble hormones will just have to bind to the receptor. And this is showing most likely a hormone bound to its receptor on the membrane. So this is most likely a water-soluble hormone. And again, this is just also showing just how they're specific. So for example, this hormone cannot bind to this target cell because it can't bind to the receptors that are very specific to only a specific type of hormone. So here's nuclear and membrane-bound receptors. So this is showing, again, a lipid-soluble hormone that can pass through the cell membrane, which is here, and then it can pass through the nuclear membrane to bind to a receptor to cause DNA to produce a different type of protein. This is showing a water-soluble hormone that cannot pass through the cell membrane, so it binds to a membrane-bound receptor that oftentimes is involved in kind of this cascade response with a G protein producing cyclic AMP. Those are just two important kind of proteins inside the cell that will eventually control a cellular response. So the action of nuclear receptors, lipid-soluble hormones normally stimulate protein synthesis. And again, that's because lipid-soluble hormones can get into the nucleus to tell the DNA to start transcription and translation. Lipid-soluble hormones will diffuse across the cell membrane, bind to receptors, with the complex now binding to the hormone response elements on DNA. And this action regulates the transcription of specific messenger ribonucleic acid molecules, and protein synthesis will occur. So again, big picture here, as long as you know that lipid-soluble hormones, again, they are able to pass through the cell membrane because they're made of lipids, just like the cell membrane is made of lipids, so they can mix. They also can get into the nucleus, pass through the nuclear membrane. And just what they do when that happens is they bind to their nuclear receptor and they start the process of protein synthesis. And if you remember, protein synthesis was that really complicated process of transcription and translation to eventually produce proteins. And again, big picture, what you should know is just that lipid-soluble hormones are able to control the produce of proteins because they can get into the nucleus to tell the DNA to start protein synthesis. Membrane receptor actions. So this would be with water-soluble proteins that cannot get into the cell. So they will bind to a membrane receptor. And membrane receptors will act in two ways, either altering the activity of a G protein, which starts that cascade of intracellular enzymes. Activation of the G proteins will elicit a specific response in your cells, including the production of important molecules that we call second messengers that are kind of like the mediator between getting from point A to point B. The second messenger just helps us get there. So the second messenger is produced inside the cell once a ligand binds to its membrane-bound receptor, and that can be a hormone. A second messenger, like cyclic AMP, will then activate a specific cellular process inside the cell in response to the hormone. G protein activation, this just means that many of these water-soluble proteins will bind to the membrane-bound receptor. They will produce a response through the action of G proteins, which consist of 3 subunits. You don't need to know specifics about the G proteins, but what you should know is that the G proteins will interact with adenylene cyclase that will convert ATP to cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP, again, is important because it binds to protein kinases and activates them. So it basically will activate proteins here. Protein kinases are enzymes in turn that will regulate other enzymes. So depending on the other enzyme, protein kinases will increase or decrease its activity. And we have a specific enzyme called phosphodiesterase that breaks down cyclic AMP and thus results in no further cell stimulation. So again, think big picture here. We talked about two types of hormones. The lipid-soluble hormones, I have a princess Band-Aid on my finger. The lipid-soluble proteins can get through the cell membrane into the nucleus and tell the DNA to make proteins. Water-soluble proteins or hormones cannot get into the cell, so they will bind to a membrane receptor that starts this kind of activation of proteins, specifically G proteins, and the G proteins will be what will go on and activate cyclic AMP that will activate other protein kinases, which are enzymes that control like the chemical regulation of other chemical processes. So G protein activation will control the activation of cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP will either produce protein kinases to make a cellular response, and again, all based on this hormone binding to the cell, or it can make it inactivated. So it can produce phosphodiesterase, which will inactivate cyclic AMP so that the cell does not respond anymore. And what we're trying to kind of show you or teach you guys in big picture is that these hormones, whether they're going into the nucleus or just binding themselves to the membrane, this is what happens when your hormones are released from the brain and they go on to have an effect on your cell. So if it's a growth hormone, that's going to tell this cell to divide and grow because it needs to produce growth in the body. If it's a thyroid hormone, it's going to increase metabolism. So we're kind of starting out really small, and then we'll get to big picture to see what all these hormones do in the body. So signal amplification refers to the idea that hormones can stimulate the synthesis of second messengers to act quickly to have an amplification effect, which means that each receptor when it binds to one hormone, can produce thousands of second messengers, leading to a cascade effect and ultimately a huge amplification of a hormonal signal. So when one hormone binds to a cell, thousands of second messengers will be produced. So it will have a huge amplification of that original hormonal signal. With amplification, a single hormone can activate many second messengers, which in turn can activate enzymes that produce an enormous amount of final product. And this efficiency of a second messenger amplification, it's unparalleled in the body. And this is why I think the endocrine system is so amazing, is that one teeny tiny hormone can have a huge effect on the rest of your body processes. And if any of you guys know anyone who has too many thyroid hormones, who's hyperthyroid, or who has too little thyroid hormones, hypothyroid, you know that their level of thyroid hormone and their synthetic thyroid hormone that they're taking, like Synthroid, if it's off by just less than a milliliter, it can really cause them to feel terrible. So little teeny tiny hormones will have a huge effect on the body. And this is that cascade effect that's showing. Hyper and hypothyroid run in my family. Oftentimes it affects women more than men, but men can have thyroid problems too. But that's why I bring up hyper or hypothyroidism, because it's just not fun. It's when your thyroid is all out of whack and you have to usually take synthetic hormones to regulate the levels of thyroid hormone, or some people just get their thyroid completely removed if it's emitting or secreting too much thyroid hormones. So let's go through into kind of the fun stuff now, or that I think is fun. I'm the nerd here, but hopefully you guys find this interesting too. So your pituitary gland is a very small gland in the body. It's controlled by the hypothalamus, and we divide it into a front and a back part, the anterior and the posterior part. And each part of your pituitary gland secretes different hormones. Between the two, they secrete at least 6. So here's the pituitary gland, and on the bottom, it's showing you these the hormones that it's secreting. The posterior pituitary gland secretes ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which controls blood fluid levels, urination levels, ion levels, blood pressure levels in the body. Oxytocin is released from posterior pituitary, and that acts on the uterus to control muscle contraction, as well as oxytocin is the hormone that allows the milk to be let down in the breast when the baby is nursing. And again, if you've ever breastfed your kids, you know what I'm talking about. So this is sometimes a good test question, is what are the only 2 hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary? And that's antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The rest, you kind of have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are all released from the anterior pituitary. We have growth hormone, GH, which acts on all of your body cells to stimulate growth. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, acts on the adrenal cortex to release some of the stress response hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, this is what acts on the thyroid gland to release adequate amounts of thyroid hormones. And then we have FSH and LH. This is follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the production of follicles, which go on to create eggs and sperm. And then luteinizing hormone acts on both to help with the control of the sex hormones, the androgens. We have melanocyte stimulating hormone, which acts on parts of the skin to produce melanocytes, which help to protect the skin from UV rays. And then prolactin is actually the hormone that controls lactation, but the idea of creating milk in the breast. So oxytocin and prolactin get a little confusing. Prolactin helps you to produce the milk in the breast. Again, these hormones are released usually right after childbirth, and then oxytocin specifically lets the milk down. If you don't know what I mean by that, ask someone who's nursing or breastfeeding in a very kind way, and they'll help you understand that. But so your anterior pituitary gland actions, it synthesizes hormones that are under the control of the hypothalamus gland, and neurons of the hypothalamus will secrete what we call releasing hormones that will stimulate the production and secretion of a specific hormone. or the hypothalamus can actually release an inhibiting hormone that will decrease the secretion of a specific anterior pituitary hormone. So we have stimuli from the nervous system, because again, all of this is initially under nervous system control, that acts on your hypothalamus to secrete releasing and inhibiting hormones. And you can see those shown here. And these releasing and inhibiting hormones will then act on the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones, whether they inhibit or stimulate a specific target tissue or endocrine gland, and the stimulatory effect is shown in green. Growth hormones. So now we'll get into some of the hormones, which I think are fun to learn about. So we'll talk about growth hormone first. The target tissues for growth hormone, this is most tissues, and that's because growth hormone acts on almost all of your body cells to help them divide and grow. So your growth hormone will stimulate the growth of bones, the growth of muscles, the growth of organs. We have some abnormalities with growth hormone. If you have too much growth hormone, this can cause giantism or gigantism, where if it affects a child, the child could grow up to 7 feet tall, and too little growth hormone can cause pituitary dwarfism. There's different types of dwarfism, but pituitary dwarfism is caused by too little growth hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. The target tissue is, it acts on your thyroid gland to regulate your thyroid gland secretion. If you have too much thyroid stimulating hormone, your thyroid glands can get bigger, and that's called a goiter. And you can often see that in the neck, and that would be too much thyroid stimulating hormone and too much thyroid hormones in the body. That can sometimes lead to severe overactive thyroid that we call Graves' disease. And if we have too little thyroid stimulating hormone, the thyroid gland can actually shrink or get smaller because it's not secreting enough thyroid hormones. So here's a great kind of, again, we use these flow charts a lot in the endocrine system to kind of figure out where everything goes. So up here is your hypothalamus, and your hypothalamus first releases a releasing hormone. So RH stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone, and that acts on the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland, to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroid stimulating hormone acts on the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. And we use a red arrow to show inhibitory and a green arrow to show stimulatory, to show that as we work our way down, TRH stimulates TSH to stimulate your thyroid hormone release. But once we have adequate levels of thyroid hormones, they will cause a negative inhibitory response, as a negative feedback response, because once their levels get high enough in the blood, they'll tell your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary to kind of shut off production because there's enough of them in the blood. This is what your thyroid hormones do in the body. They help to increase metabolism, increase body temperature, and increase normal growth and development. So people who are hyperthyroid, who have too many thyroid hormones, their metabolism is through the roof. They usually lose a lot of weight. Their body temperature is through the roof, so they're usually hot, agitated, and normal growth and development, it can affect the nervous system as well as their reproductive system. So that's with too much thyroid hormone. If we have too little thyroid hormone in the body, the metabolism is actually slowed down. So everything kind of slows down. So people who are hypothyroid, who have too little thyroid hormones, they usually gain weight or they have problem losing weight. They're usually very cold because their body, think of all the body systems are just slowing down. Their nervous system slows down, and so forth. So again, problems with your thyroid glands producing adequate thyroid hormones are just not fun. So gonadotropic hormones, we have several. These are hormones that are being released from the gonads or the testes and ovaries. We have luteinizing hormone, which in females targets your ovaries to promote ovulation and progesterone production. And luteinizing hormone in males acts on the testes to help produce sperm and testosterone. Follicle stimulating hormone, And the females, it helps to stimulate the production of follicles, so get them to their maturation, so get these eggs to mature, also control estrogen secretion. In males, it acts on the seminiferous tubules within the testes to help produce adequate amounts of sperm. So that's follicle stimulating hormone. And again, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone both act on the gonads, which are the ovaries in females and the testes in males. Prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. So the idea of lactation. MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, helps with the production of melanin in the melanocytes in the skin, which again help to protect the skin from UV rays. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, the target tissues are the cells of the adrenal cortex, which helps the production of certain corticosteroids, which are kind of your body's response to stressful stimulation. The posterior pituitary actions, again, the only two hormones released from the posterior pituitary are the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So those are the only two produced in the posterior pituitary. ADH acts on your kidneys to conserve water, and that's because it's an antidiuretic. So a diuretic helps you urinate frequently. Antidiuretic helps you urinate less. So ADH tells your kidneys to conserve water, retain more water. An abnormality with ADH is called diabetes insipidus, not to be confused with diabetes mellitus, which has to do with blood glucose levels. The reason they're both called diabetes is because these patients often present with similar symptoms. Diabetes insipidus has to do with low ADH levels. And when you don't have adequate antidiuretic hormone, your kidneys will not conserve water. They will produce large amounts of watery urine that can lead to dehydration and thirst. So frequent urination is a common symptom of a person who has diabetes insipidus, which is a problem with low ADH levels. Diabetes mellitus, which has to do with blood glucose levels, often those patients urinate frequently as well, but that's the diabetes mellitus type 1 and type 2 that have to do with blood sugar levels. Oxytocin then acts on the uterus to increase uterine contractions during labor. And here's a look at the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. The interesting thing about the connection between your hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, it's a little different because there aren't blood vessels in that connection. There were blood vessels connecting it to the anterior pituitary, but in the posterior pituitary, we have what we call a hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, where it's connected purely with neurons acting using neurohormones to control the release of these hormones. So that's the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So I'm just going to kind of keep charging through. We have a couple more slides to get through. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll try to be done here by 10:30 or maybe a little, not 8:30, excuse me, or a little sooner. So your thyroid gland is one of the largest glands in the body as a part of the endocrine system, and it requires iodine to function. And iodine was added to salt back in the 30s, 40s, as doctors were realizing that the thyroid hormone needed iodine to function. So still today, you can buy salt with iodine. It's called iodized salt. Not super necessary because we get iodine through a lot of other sources now because we have more access to fruits and vegetables. But that's why iodine was added to salt years ago. Your thyroid gland secretes thyroid hormone as well as calcitonin, which we'll talk about what that does. Your thyroid hormones are secreted by follicular cells that target most tissues, that regulate the metabolic rates, and it's very much needed for growth. Calcitonin is what will be targeting your bone to reduce blood calcium levels. And if it helps you to think of calcitonin toning down or decreasing or reducing blood calcium levels. These are the thyroid hormone disorders that I talked about a little bit already. Hypothyroidism has decreased metabolism, so we gain weight, a reduced appetite, we're fatigued, low temperature and pulse, dry, cold skin. Myxedema in adults means kind of swelling or bloating, and cretinism in infants. Hypothyroidism is what my mom has. And then hyperthyroidism is what my neighbor had. She had increased metabolism. Hers was almost to the extent of Graves' disease, which could lead to that goiter where the thyroid gland enlarges, and you can see it in your neck. Weight loss, increased appetite, nervous system. They could get heart palpitations with higher temperature and pulse, and a warm, flushed skin. So that's hyperthyroidism. Again, hypo means too little thyroid hormones, and hyper means too much. So parathyroid gland, again, it's located kind of in P-shaped structures on the thyroid gland, and it will regulate calcium levels even more so than calcitonin, and it will target your bones and kidneys. So for example, if calcium levels are low, osteoclasts will break down bone and less calcium is lost in urine. So that's why your kidneys kind of come into play here. And if calcium levels are too high, then osteoclasts don't break down the bone as much and more calcium is lost in urine. So here's regulation of blood calcium levels. And you've seen kind of some of these charts before when we look at homeostatic imbalances. So here's the normal homeostatic range of blood calcium. And if it gets too high or too low out of that range, something occurs. So if we're getting too high, calcium levels are too high, the parathyroid gland decreases PTH secretions. So we have decreased bone reabsorption, decreased uptake of calcium from the intestine, and kidneys resolve. So we kind of get our normal blood levels back to normal. And if we have blood calcium levels are decreasing, parathyroid gland increases parathyroid hormone secretion, which basically tells your osteoclasts to break up more bone to put calcium back into the blood to restore our normal calcium levels. Thyroid gland and parathyroid glands. This is a look at a thyroid follicle. Some of the cells in the thyroid gland and with the parathyroid gland in the back shown here, and just to look at what these thyroid follicles look like and how the parathyroid gland looks different. So the thyroid follicles kind of look empty and the parathyroid glands look kind of fuller. All right, adrenal gland actions. Your adrenal glands are two small glands located on the top of each kidney. Each adrenal gland has an inner part, which we call the medulla, and an outer part called the cortex. And the cortex and the medulla actually function as totally separate endocrine glands. So here's a look at the endocrine gland itself and how it sits on top of the kidney, and then how the cortex makes up the outer layer and the medulla makes up the inner, deeper layer, and that each kind of separate layer of the adrenal glands have different functions. One secretes glucocorticoids, the other secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the medulla hormones are the epinephrine, norepinephrine, and these are a part of your fight or flight response. So a response to stressful situations, epinephrine and norepinephrine will be released to target your heart, blood vessels, liver, and fat cells. And this kind of shows you the regulation that comes from the brain that could regulate the secretion of these epinephrine and norepinephrine in the target tissues. And again, it's your sympathetic nervous system because that's the fight or flight response. Stress, physical activity, and low blood glucose levels could all stimulate this epinephrine and norepinephrine response. And this is what they will do: increase blood pressure, increase metabolic rate of skeletal muscles. So basically everything that gets your body ready for kind of to fight or to fly away. So kind of any sort of stressful situation. Adrenal cortex hormones, we basically have aldosterone, which acts on the kidneys to help retain sodium and water. So aldosterone will be kind of indirectly involved with blood pressure and blood volume, because when aldosterone gets secreted, it tells your kidneys to retain water and retain sodium. So it helps to control your blood pressure and blood volume. So here's the regulation of aldosterone secretion. You can see here it has a stimulatory effect. Basically, if we have decreased levels of sodium, that will stimulate the retention of sodium and decreased water loss. So to try to retain water in the body. This is actually looking at what we call the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which uses aldosterone to kind of start a system that helps to constrict your blood vessels and try to increase blood pressure in the body. This renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system uses renin stimulated or released from the kidneys, angiotensin. And what kind of this system does is this system is important in emergency situations. So if someone has lost a lot of blood or is bleeding internally or externally and their blood fluid levels are decreasing, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone will all work to try to constrict blood vessels, to try to increase blood pressure, or tell the kidneys to retain more water to increase blood pressure that way. More adrenal gland hormones, we have cortisol, which increases the breakdown of fat and protein for energy uses, reduces inflammatory and immune responses. So that's cortisol. Here's the regulation of cortisol secretion. Again, it's coming from the hypothalamus, acting on the pituitary gland to secrete ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone that acts on the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Androgens, so again, more adrenal gland hormones. Androgens are like your sex hormones. So they will help to secrete sex hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone that specifically will help with either secondary sex characteristics or sex drive and the development of that, especially during puberty. The secretion of the androgens will increase. And then we're going to kind of end. We have about 10 slides left. You guys are doing great with your pancreas a little bit. If someone has an adrenal tumor, thanks for asking a question. I can take a sip of my water, Kathy. So Kathy's asking, a tumor in your adrenal gland and a part of the adrenal gland has to be removed, which often occurs if a tumor happens anywhere in the body, it would have to be removed, and then you would lose some of this hormone producing functions. Possibly. So their stressful circumstance, I mean, not necessarily their reaction to stress, but their conscious reaction to stress, but they're more what their body goes through in response to stress, the fight or flight response. Yeah, they might have a decreased or lower level of that, depending on what part of the adrenal gland would be removed. A lot of these hormones we have synthetic versions of as well. So, if you remove a part of your thyroid gland, or some women have to get their ovaries removed, and a lot of people who get an endocrine gland removed for one part or the other, they could just take a synthetic hormone for the rest of their life as well. But yeah, whenever you would remove a gland, you would remove the ability of that gland to secrete a hormone in this situation that would create epinephrine or norepinephrine for that flight or fight response. So yeah, that person would have to take some sort of synthetic hormone. Oftentimes, if you have a tumor on the pituitary gland, it could cause the pituitary gland to secrete too much growth hormone or too little growth hormone. So yeah, that could cause complications for sure. But thankfully, in our day and age, we have lots of synthetic hormones we could take or other options. Yeah, good question. So your pancreas is a really fun gland because it actually has an exocrine function and an endocrine function. And what I mean by that, we've been talking about endocrine system. So think hormones released into the bloodstream. The exocrine function of the pancreas means it can release some things via ducts, and ducts meaning like some digestive enzymes that will go into your small intestine to help with digestion. So that's the exocrine portion, helping with digestion. The endocrine part of the pancreas consists of what we call the pancreatic islets, the islets of Langerhans, again, probably named after the guy who discovered them, which are dispersed throughout the exocrine portion of the pancreas. And the islets consist of 3 cell types. Alpha cells secrete glucagon, beta cells secrete insulin, and delta cells secrete somatostatin. All 3 hormones regulate blood levels of nutrients, especially glucose. What insulin does is that decreases blood glucose levels. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels. And somatostatin has to do with growth hormone, and we'll talk about that. So here we have the pancreatic islets, which make up the endocrine portion of the pancreas. So the lighter color here, these are the parts that create the hormones, and then surrounding them are the acidae, which will secrete the digestive enzymes that travel through this long yellow duct to the small intestine. And then within the pancreatic islets, we have delta cells secreting somatostatin, alpha cells secreting glucagon, and beta cells secreting insulin. So that's a look at the structure of the pancreas. Insulin itself is a hormone that targets liver, skeletal muscle, adipose tissue. It helps to regulate blood glucose levels. So for example, after you eat a big meal, your glucose levels are high from all the food that you ate. So insulin will be secreted to try to decrease those glucose levels in the blood. So what insulin will do is it will actually take glucose out of the blood and take it to a tissue that can use it, or either to the liver where it'll be stored. And extra glucose is stored in the liver as the form of glycogen. Diabetes mellitus means there's too little insulin, or there are faulty insulin receptors. So diabetes type 1 means that there's too little insulin. So these people are insulin dependent, a daily injection is required. Usually type 1 diabetic patients, this is out of their control. They got it when they were little, a kid, or later on in life. But what's happening here is their cells are not secreting enough insulin. Type 2 diabetes is more with the faulty insulin receptors. So your body's creating enough insulin, but your cells aren't responding to it. And these guys type 2 diabetics are insulin independent because their bodies are producing enough insulin, but their cells aren't responding to it. So this can often be found in obese people. It can be treated with diet and exercise. But what happens is the type 2 can often turn into type 1, where the body is just the cells, the insulin is not being used properly. Eventually the cells are working too hard, so that eventually type 2 diabetics will require insulin. So that's why you might hear someone who's pre-diabetic, with diet and exercise, they can maybe keep it under control, but it could turn into being insulin dependent, where they would need the insulin shots. Symptoms of diabetes mellitus are exaggerated appetite, excess urine, dehydration, thirst, and fatigue. Glucagon then is the second type of hormone in the pancreas. It targets the liver because it helps to decrease blood glucose levels. So between meals, the glucose levels will drop, and glucagon it increases blood glucose levels. I'm so sorry. So between meals, when your glucose levels drop, your glucagon will actually be secreted to try to increase your blood glucose levels, and glucagon will go to the liver and it will take glycogen and break it down into the form of glucose to be secreted into the blood to try to increase blood glucose levels, and that's glucagon. So here's the regulation of blood glucose levels. If blood glucose levels increase, as shown here, pancreatic islets detect that increase to secrete insulin, and then insulin decreases your blood glucose levels. If blood glucose levels decrease, the receptors secrete more glucagon, which will act in the liver to try to increase your blood glucose levels. So those are the two hormones that regulate your blood glucose levels. And then we go to the testes hormone. The big one here is testosterone. And testosterone targets most tissue, especially when males are going through puberty. Testosterone helps to lower their voice, lengthens the vocal cords. When it does that, it causes the Adam's apple or the thyroid cartilage to increase. So that's why in males, they often have a larger or more prominent Adam's apple or their thyroid cartilage, because testosterone is actually acting on their voice box to increase, to lower their voice. Testosterone aids in sperm and reproductive organ development and function. So adequate levels of testosterone are very important in males for all reproductive functions, secondary sex characteristics, the growth of facial hair, the lowering of the voice, and so forth. That's testosterone. The ovarian hormones are estrogen and progesterone, and they also target many target tissues They're involved in the uterine and mammary gland development, as well as the menstrual cycle. So the idea of getting uterus ready for the implantation of a fertilized egg, and if that doesn't occur, the uterine walls will degrade and that woman will have her period. So that's kind of all of this is under control, these cycles of estrogen and progesterone. The thymus gland, and then we're pretty much done here. Thymosin targets most of your immune system tissues. So it helps to promote immune system development and function. And melatonin targets your hypothalamus, and it helps to play a role in the onset of puberty, and also controls your circadian rhythm, which is the sleep and wake cycles. So you might hear people giving melatonin to their kids or their animals or yourself. They say it's natural. I haven't really looked into the effects too much of that. Maybe you guys know more about melatonin supplements. And light can also affect its function, which makes sense because we're trying to control sleep and wake cycles. So great work getting through this, guys. I'll stop the recording.